Tashidale, everyone. Hi, I'm Rashi Chori. I'm the lead campaigns coordinator at International Tibet Network. We're a coalition of about 140 different organizations who are fighting for restoring rights to Tibetan people. Today, as many countries are celebrating World Children's Day, we cannot forget that there are over 1 million Tibetan children who are in China's boarding schools in Tibet. Now, these schools were exposed by Tibet Action Institute in a report in 2021, and this and the report kind of brought forward evidence of these schools forcibly taking children away, tearing them from their families, their parents, their culture, their religion, and putting them in these state-run boarding schools that not only strips them of their childhood but also of their language, their identity, their culture. And children as young as 4 year old have been put in these schools. So at an age when you're still forming relationships and when you're learning about your culture and your religion, you've been taken away from your families and put in these schools. To speak about this and the issue and the implications of having a system like this in place are joining me three very young Tibetan leaders. Please let me introduce Sela. She is a Tibetan American activist from New York and serves as the current campaigns coordinator at Students for a Free Tibet. The next person joining us is from London. Tenzin Rapkatashi is the digital communications and campaigns officer at Free Tibet, and is the former Tibetan community and Britain youth coordinator and council member. And finally, joining us today is Tenzin Palsangla, who is the president of RTYC Minnesota. She's also served in the regional chapter of Tibetan Youth Congress for almost 3 years now. Still, it's like I said, I mean, we know so much about these schools already, but what we also want to know more is about what are the implications of these schools? Like, how are these school systems impacting Tibetan language, Tibetan culture, Tibetan religion? Um, so, Stella, I want to come to you first. How do these schools restrict the language, culture, and religious practices? And then, what are the long term implications of such policies on the future of Tibetan language?
Yeah, so we know that in these Chinese colonial boarding schools inside Tibet, that they have a very carefully crafted curriculum, right? Everything about these schools, has been thought out and strategized as part of China's broader national plan, which includes how do they squash Tibet? How do they squash Tibetan identity? Because we know that for all too long, Tibetans and Tibetan identity, our mere existence has posed a threat. So we know that in the curriculum, Mandarin is mandated as the sole and primary language of instruction. So in, I believe, 2021, the National People's Congress ruled that Mandarin had to be taught in like elementary school, or not even elementary school, preschool, which is totally in contravention to their claim that they have, China's claim that they have a bilingual language policy, which is absolutely not the case. And in terms of religion, Tibetans are separated from their family from the ages of 4, even younger now. And this means that they have no contact with Buddhism, with Tibetan Buddhism. They have no, because China's policy is to separate language, and it is like a secular education policy, right? So when you're at school for almost 365 days a year, hardly ever seeing your family, ripped from your parents' arms, what that means is that you're never in contact with your religion. So Tibetan children grow up not knowing about Tibetan Buddhism. And in fact, there was an anecdote that said that a Tibetan child went home and they felt like a stranger in their own home. And lastly, they obligate Tibetan children to pledge their loyalty to the CCP, and to sing the Chinese national anthem, and really kind of try and mold them into these like perfect little Chinese citizens, fully stripping them of any semblance of their Tibetan identity. And when I think about what the long-term implications are and what this really means for Tibetans and Tibetan children and the Tibetan nation, I can't help but feel really, really worried, because take language in and of itself. Language is not just one tenet of our culture that's being lost. It's really like the medium for Tibetan culture and for Tibetan identity. It's the vessel, right? Like, traditionally, all indigenous histories and stories are passed down orally. And when a parent can't communicate with their child, that is fully lost. And so we really see this colonial boarding school system inside Tibet as being the cornerstone for China's broader efforts to systematically eradicate Tibetan identity. That Tibetans have long posed such an issue, has long been such like a thorn in China's side, that they know as long as Tibetans exist, Tibetans are going to resist. So what's the solution? Is to nip it in the bud. To target the youth, to target the education system, because education is really the spring wall for society and how a society functions, right? All of the key reproductives, from language to culture, they originate with how you're socialized and in your education system. And so that means that through this extensive colonial boarding school system that has now ripped around 1 million children from their parents' arms, they aim to eradicate Tibetan identity within a single generation. And so I think broader implications, I think it's a really, really insidious tool. And I think it poses a huge threat, not only to the Tibetan nation at large and what it means to be Tibetan, but also to children. Children who cannot speak up for themselves, and who, despite their greatest efforts, are to some extent very helpless in what they can do to support themselves. And so broader implications, I think, if we don't act quickly, and if we don't act with the urgency that it demands, I think we're going to see a very, very different Tibetan society and a very, very different definition of what it means to be Tibetan 20 years down the line.
Thanks, Ella. Yeah, it's everything that you said. It just really makes me think about all the other boarding school systems that we've had exposed in the past. Like it happened in Canada, we've had seen that in Australia as well. But another thing that China has been doing, and is now, like, we're seeing droves and droves of evidence on it, is not only are they taking Tibetan children and putting them in Chinese boarding schools in Tibet, but they're also shutting down Tibetan language schools, right? Like, where parents, one option that parents had were to send children to these Tibetan speaking schools where they could learn their own language, where they could learn their religion and culture, and now they're actively shutting it down. And we've seen that, like, actually, Free Tibet, Rapka, did like a page on it. They've been tracking down all these schools that have been shut down, and we recently saw that in June or July, the Rage Gangjok Sherik Norbu Lobling school was shut down. We saw videos from it as well. Like, let me actually have a clip I would like to play for it, where we saw students crying at the closing ceremony of their school. Let me play that and then I'll come to you, So this is just one of the many private Tibetan speaking schools that have been shut down in the recent past. Ravka, can you talk a little bit about the implications of school shutdowns on Tibetan future generations? Like, when the option to speak Tibetan language is taken away, what would happen to the next generations in Tibet?
Of course. So young Tibetan children inside Tibet, they are completely aware of the changing situation. With their schools being shut down, their local schools, they know that their only options now are state school. So inside, it builds a sort of tragic case. They start to feel anxiety. They understand that their identity, their very selves, is at risk. They know that they'll be taken away from their parents. So putting anyone listening now, putting themselves in the shoes of these children, just imagine being ages 4 to 18, just imagine being taken from your parents. So they not only have to navigate through dealing with the systematic erasure of their education, their Tibetan education system, they now face not only academic stress, but the stress of identity crisis as well. So this is something that not many will be familiar with. This is something that's uniquely a Tibetan experience at the moment. So in terms of the impacts on future generations of Tibetan children, we know that already it's a situation that looks as though it's irreversible, that many young Tibetan children feel as though their lifeline is through their community, is through their family. But taking away language instruction, taking away Tibetan, only teaching Tibetan as you would in Western countries, like me, for instance, I learned Spanish in school. It was maybe 1 hour a day or maybe 1 hour every 2 days. And like that's the case with Tibetan children learning Tibetan inside Tibet. So the way we see it in the Western countries is we're learning a foreign language. Using that same concept inside Tibet, it's making Tibetan children feel as though Chinese Mandarin is their native language and Tibetan is the foreign language. So now you're creating this mindset inside them that, okay, I guess Tibetan isn't as important. It's not a priority for them. So then going home, speaking with a family, as Teller said excellently, that there is a disconnect. There's history taught orally for thousands of years, from mother to daughter, father to son, and vice versa. Now we're seeing a complete disconnect of this line of history. So there's a grave threat with this. We're looking at something that could see the entire erasure, the entire extinction of the Tibetan identity. And the only thing left would be young children having the Tibetan name and then just the ethnicity of being Tibetan as well. And even that is at risk as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Rabka. Um, I think I think one thing that most people always come back and ask is how are these boarding schools in Tibet, these Chinese-run boarding schools in Tibet, compared to boarding schools globally, right? Like how are these different, or what are their similarities? So, Pasang, I know you've been looking into it for a while. I'd like to come to you now. If you could talk a little bit about what are the similarities or differences between China's boarding schools in Tibet versus boarding schools globally.
Hmm. Well, the fact is they don't. They don't compare. The Chinese boarding schools in Tibet are a human rights crisis because they don't compare at all to boarding schools elsewhere. First of all, there wasn't really a need for them. The need for them was created by forcibly shutting down many existing and some exceptionally reputable Tibetan schools across the country. The schools shut down were local schools, they were day schools. Some of these schools provided not just education, but critical care and resources to orphans. So, with these dwindling alternatives and China's consolidation measures, parents have no choice but to send their kids to these Chinese boarding schools. And then, secondly, the attendance is not a free choice. By eliminating the existing schools, they took away that choice. And China is also implementing very vindictive and coercive policies and practices to get Tibetan children into these schools. Families are told that if you don't send your child to the boarding preschool, then your child can't join in the elementary school. Or families are also told if you don't send your first child to boarding school, then your second and third child will also be denied education. So these are very vindictive policies. They have no like best interest of the community or the children or the families in their minds. So with these different methods, they're coercing the family to comply in an environment that is already broadly pressuring Tibetans to let go of their nomadic way of life. Parents have to face fines, penalties, threats, and in a few cases, arrests. There's one case in Rebkong, eastern Tibet. The parents appealed to authorities and then they collectively protested. That protest was met with police crackdown, and ultimately their children were also taken away. Thirdly, the school experience is intended to erase students' cultural identity and indoctrinate them with the beliefs of the colonial power. So since coming to power in 2012, Xi Jinping has embraced a fundamental change in policy towards Tibetans, Uyghurs, Mongolians, and other non-Chinese groups. The party now seeks to remake non-Chinese identities into a single Chinese identity as a way of suppressing dissent and ensuring continued CCP control. CCP ideology and political objectives are heavily integrated into boarding school life, and that is no secret. The 2015 State Council decision on accelerating the development of ethnic education requires unremitting propaganda and education on socialism with Chinese characteristics and the China dream. And it calls for guidance for students to continuously strengthen their recognition of the great motherland, the Chinese nation, Chinese culture, the Communist Party of China, and the socialism with Chinese characteristics. So there's no Tibet or Tibetan in any of that. So this propaganda is central to the school experience. That kind of indoctrination leaves students living away from their communities, extremely vulnerable to losing their connection to their history, their roots, and all the aspects that make them Tibetan. These children are taught completely in Mandarin, while Tibetan language is increasingly becoming criminalized. Live streaming in Tibetan is not allowed on China's popular video sharing apps. Language preservation associations and chat groups are targeted. Advocacy for Tibetan language teaching is punished with imprisonment. And then lastly, students live apart from their parents, families, and communities. China is not just opening boarding schools, they're consolidating Tibetans into them. These schools are often not near the families and communities of the students. If the children's best interest was a priority, the Chinese government could just improve the existing day schools or build new ones within the communities. Instead, they are intentionally forcing Tibetan children into isolated residential style schools. When students are separated from their families, they lose that daily influence of language, culture, and religion that exists at home, and become more vulnerable to the norms and ideology of their school environment. The residential component of the boarding schools intentionally targets Tibetan children. In 2012, China faced widespread resistance in China by Chinese parents, protesting closures of rural schools in China and children being consolidated into boarding schools. So when China faced these protests by Chinese parents, they rolled back the policies and local schools were reestablished. The converse happened in Tibet. China buckled down even harder, and even children who live in large urban areas like Lhasa, even students who live 10 minutes from their school, they are forced to board rather than return to their families in the evenings. So in other words, Tibetan children are forced into boarding schools, not because they live in remote areas, but because they are Tibetan. These policies very specifically target Tibetans. Even if they have family nearby, schools only permit contact every weekend or every 10 days. Some families see their child once a year at best. Those who see their families on weekends have accounted that their children have become completely distant and foreign to the families they once belonged to. So none of this compares to boarding schools anywhere else. These vindictive policies surrounding boarding schools and the content taught within the schools make it evident that this is not an initiative with the child's best interests prioritized, nor Tibetan people and culture as a whole.
Thanks, Falsa. And that's actually really heartbreaking to hear, because we can not only can we see evidence of China's double standards in boarding schools in Tibet and in mainland China, but we can see that like there is precedent to these schools. That we've seen residential schools in Canada. We've seen, in fact, recently Joe Biden did that apology, which was so powerful against the boarding school systems that they ran, in North America. So it blows my mind that this is happening, and that there has been evidence that 1 million Tibetan children have been taken and put in these schools as young as 4 years old. At 4 years old, I don't even remember Like, what do you learn at 4 years? You're a wee little baby. You're a toddler. You completely depend on your parents to learn your language, to pick up on your culture, to learn everything. But when you were talking, I also started thinking about language, and the impact of culture, and then also impact of erasure, and how it like trickles down during generations. I was in fact talking to someone a while ago, and I was telling them how like when India was colonized for 200 years, most of like people went to, the ones who could were taken into boarding schools, and they, medium of language was English. And even when India got independent, colonization works in different ways. So to succeed, you needed to speak English. So I'm a second generation free Indian, who grew up in free India. My dad went to a day school, which was like a colonized, remaining colonized school, which had like all of these um, sisters and corporal punishment and everything. And he taught me that you need to speak English. You need to speak English. You need to speak English to succeed in life, because he was taught that. To a point where I'm now 34, I can speak Hindi, but I don't think in Hindi. And it was a very, very heartbreaking realization for me that that's how languages go, right? That you teach people to be ashamed of their own language, that you teach children that if you don't speak this particular language, you will not succeed in this country. And then the next generations would just start pushing that away, would start pushing that on, right? And we're seeing that in Tibet right now. Like this younger generation who are in these colonial boarding schools, when they grow up and they have kids and they can't speak Tibetan, they've been, oh, you need to speak Mandarin to succeed, you know? And that's how languages go. Um, so I just wanted to kind of open up the floor, because you all are three young, very powerful Tibetan activists. You're in the States, in the UK, you all travel the world, you go around speaking about different campaigns, and you hold so much power in your identity. So I want to come back again to you, Palsang. Why is this an issue so important to you? Why do you think people should speak up about boarding school? Why is it so important to you?
Um, well, first of all, it's really important to me because we're talking about children. You know, they are our most vulnerable demographic. And the fact that they are in vulnerable positions, there have been cases or accounts of sexual assault, abuse, neglect, um, malnourishment, you know, and the fact that so many Tibetan children are being consolidated under these conditions is absolutely heartbreaking. So, just the fact that they're children is deeply troubling. Sorry. And then, secondly, as we were talking, language is really important. And it seems like, in terms of colonization, the last frontier is colonization of the mind. And this is going to be a huge generational shift. The effects of these policies, like we see a little bit now, but 5 years from now, 10 years from now, it's going to be like catastrophic. So that's why it's really important that we raise awareness and do something about it in the early stages.
Thanks, Palsang. Rabka.
For me, it's important as a Tibetan and, of course, as a human being. Anyone with a moral compass, anyone with a shred of dignity should care about this issue, this campaign. And I'd go as far as to say that the colonial boarding school issue might be the most important campaign in Tibet's history. We've never faced this risk, this existential danger before. And now, again, as Barcelona mentioned, they are children. But it doesn't just affect the children of Tibet, it affects every facet of Tibetan society, Tibetan existence. For example, the Tibetan teachers, when these schools are being shut down, what happens to them? They've been arrested, they've been detained, beaten. When they're released, where do they go for employment? They already have a black mark on their names. And then we look at the effects of the children that end up coming out, as Dr. Gallo once mentioned. Many of the children that go through the boarding school process, when they come out, they're not proficient in Chinese because they've joined at either a later stage in childhood development. So they won't be proficient in Chinese, but then they also won't be proficient in Tibetan as well. Communication is how we engage with each other, how we talk our language. So if we can't engage with each other, then if we can't network, we end up becoming marginalized. We end up living in the fringes of society. And that's the reality for Tibetan children. And that's why it scares me. And I hope it scares other people. I hope it scares us enough to take further action.
Yeah, thanks, Rabka. I mean, before I come to you, Shella, for your closing remarks, I think a lot of people feel like, okay, I know about this, but what do I do? There are like many things that people can do. So from writing, tweeting, Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, however you want to reach out to your foreign minister, reach out to them and urge your foreign ministers to express serious concern at all levels about China's state-run colonial boarding schools in Tibet. And then for them to call onto the Chinese government to halt the implementation of the colonial boarding schools. Another thing that you can do is go onto this link down below, so bit.ly Protect Tibet Education, and sign this petition that is also addressed to foreign ministers, urging them to push China to reopen Tibetan schools. China has been on a streak of closing down multiple Tibetan language schools. We've seen it with whether it was with Sengruk Taksay School, and then Rinchen Ki was arrested, or whether it was with Gangdong Sharek Norbu Lobling School. I've seen so many schools being shut down. So sign the petition and ask your foreign ministers, urge them to push China, to call on China, to denounce their attempts to eradicate Tibet's distinct identity, and push them to reopen Tibetan schools. Public action, supporter action is one of the most important steps that people can take when it comes to colonial boarding schools right now. And I think that's pretty much what we need to come together and do. Sela, what do you think about how does this impact you?
Yeah, well, I mean, firstly, you said you were talking about public calls to action and what are some ways that we can channel our voices in exile and as allies. And I think that's really, really important that we don't lose sight of potential for change. I think it's really easy to think about the CCP, to think about the Chinese government and the suffocating conditions that Tibetans live under in occupation and feel hopeless, that the Chinese government is such a deeply entrenched power that can't be shaken. But China's hold on power only exists or only is able to continue contingent on no challenges to their power. And that's exactly why they have established this colonial boarding school system inside of Tibet, because they are scared, because they know that Tibetans, despite 65 years of occupation and repression, continue to resist against the most highest of odds. And aside from, traditional political dissidents performed by both, Tibetans or Chinese dissidents, Tibetans pose a threat to China because we're different. And any difference is a threat. It risks fracturing this idea of like a perfect, homogenous, united China that the CCP has in mind. And as we've talked about, these colonial boarding schools make it such that China's policy is now to make being a Tibetan a crime inside Tibet. And that means, in terms of why it's so important to me, that means that children are growing up feeling like foreigners in their own land and and being treated like criminals in their own land. And I think it's really, really easy to reduce our issues to numbers, especially when we're out campaigning and, right, we're talking to different high-level decision-making bodies. It's really easy to quantify our struggle in numbers, and 1 million children is a really big number. But I think we cannot forget, and we ought to remember that every single one of these 1 million, probably more, are individual children who are suffering. And maybe some of folks watching have seen online the videos of those children who were trying to flee from their colonial boarding schools to return back to their monastery. And they have no means to express themselves or to help themselves besides running. And, we've heard we've heard some cases of, abuse inside of these colonial boarding schools. And I think it's our job in exile as Tibetans, as allies, to do everything we can, because Tibetans inside Tibet are doing what they can. They are resisting in their own ways, whether it be teaching their kids Tibetan, whether it be, certain acts of non-cooperation, hakar, so many different ways that Tibetans have found subtle forms of resistance that still pose a risk to their life and still really put them in the line of fire. And yet they do it because they know that they have a duty. And us in exile, we have so much more to work with. And so I think it's really important that we strike while the iron's hot from like a strategic perspective, that this is an issue that has really, really high potential to gain a global audience and to gain international attention, because it is an issue of children and because it is an issue that has precedence. And so, yeah, although I think we mustn't forget that these changes are irreversible, and that's why it's so urgent. We also must not forget that we still have time and we still have potential if we act now.
Thanks, Ella. I think that's a really great point, because it's like we've seen that just this year. We've seen 20. So China had their UPR cycle this year, and we had 21 states make 23 recommendations on different issues, human rights issues and violations in Tibet. And some of them were about boarding schools, some of them were about the colonial boarding schools that China is running in Tibet. And just to kind of set a little bit of context in that, this is 21 states versus the 10 states which made recommendations in the last cycle. So it was double the number. And that happened because of supporter action. That happened because people were writing to their foreign ministers. There were organizations and there were teams on ground going and lobbying their governments, asking them to raise Tibet on every single level. And that's why we must keep doing it, because like you said, like 1 million as a number just sounds so large, but like that one entire number makes up for one child. That's a lot of children we're talking about. And so it's we don't have the time, we don't have the luxury to not take action. We're talking about the future of an entire people. We're talking about entire generations of Tibetans. So please go down to the website tibetstolenchildren.org, learn more about the issue. Please take action. Please share and amplify this video. Today's World Children's Day. There are going to be existing conversations happening on multiple social media platforms. Talk about Tibetan children there. Talk about how they've been taken from their families and put in these schools. And do not let China get away with it. Thank you so much. We see you next month.